So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our next Keynote Conversation speaker. We're going to use the same format that we did last night. I'm going to introduce Dr. Isaac Prilleltensky, tell you a little bit about him and why I'm so excited that he is here. He's going to speak to us for about 20 minutes about some of his recent thinking and work, and then we're going to Oprah-style sit in the chairs with the microphones and have a bit more of an informal conversation and have some time for questions that you all have. And I gotta put the glasses on again. Sadly, my eyes are not as resilient as they once were. So it's really a huge pleasure for me to introduce Isaac to all of you. He is one of the first colloquium speakers that I heard when I was a junior faculty member at UNH. I won't say how many years ago. Isaac and I will just a long time ago, and we were both 5. It's my story, I'm sticking to it. And really was trying to figure out how to put together an academic career as someone who was trained in clinical and community psychology and really valued social justice. And he came and spoke in our department, and it was just one of those moments where you're like, oh my gosh, this person is doing this thing, it's possible. And since that time, I've used so many of his writings in my teaching of students. So it's just great to have my path cross with him again. There's a theme here of the people who work a lot and care about social justice, and so they do lots and lots of things all at the same time. Isaac Prilleltensky is cut from that same mold. He's not just doesn't have just one administrative job, he has 2. So he is at the University of Miami, where he is Vice Provost for Institutional Culture, Dean of the School of Education. He has lived and worked all over the world, and his work is influenced by the variety of communities that he has been a part of during his career. He's a visionary community psychologist whose work, as I mentioned, has taught me a great deal about seeing resilience and about really moving beyond thinking about individuals to really thinking about the broader context and the full community as a site for resilience. He was originally a clinical psychologist, but has strong roots and practices as a community psychologist, working to bridge social change at individual and community levels. He's won numerous accolades for his work, including the Lifetime Achievement Award for Prevention from Division 17, Counseling Psychology of APA, a Distinguished Contribution Award from the Community Psychology Division of APA, and has done all kinds of things from writing books on critical psychology and thinking about community to developing new measures for trying to capture all of this. And so he is going to present to us today about some of his new work about mattering and resilience. So please join me in welcoming Isaac Prilleltensky.
Okay. Thank you so much. That's very humbling. That's usually the best part of my talk, the introduction, so it's all downhill from here. I'm sorry. Okay, that wasn't my humor talk. My humor talk is later. So I will be speaking for a few minutes about a subject that I have been writing about for a while, and I'm working on a book on the topic of mattering. And I will explore the role of wellness and fairness in building resilience and strengths. So what is mattering? Mattering, in my view, consists of 2 essential moments: feeling valued and adding value. And these are 2 essential motivational forces in life. And a lot of constructs in psychology, such as belonging, the need to belong, inclusion, identity, self-representation, making a difference, feeling that you are a worthy member of your community, in my view, a lot of these constructs are captured in these 2 moments: feeling valued and adding value. And when you think about feeling valued, it's a sense of being visible, being part of a community, being part of a relationship. And that it's great, but that's not enough. We all want to feel appreciated, visible, seen, cared, respected, but that is not enough. If that were enough, we would all end up being very self-centered. And that's not how we are cut out. We also need to have a sense of accomplishment, which is what I call adding value. And there are three main sources for feeling valued and three main targets of adding value. So we first of all feel valued by ourselves, by the relationships we have in life, and by the community where we live. And by community, I encompass also work, neighborhood, faith-based groups. It's just a generic name for now. But we also want to add value. We want to add value to our own selves. We want to experience self-efficacy, mastery, and control, which are essential parts of resilience. And not just to ourselves. We want to add value to the people around us, and we want to add value to the communities where we live. And when you look historically, there are many, many examples of people who have sacrificed a great deal of their own personal well-being to make a contribution to other people. Now, when you explore a little further about the sources and the targets of feeling valued and adding value, I believe that there are two main factors. One is what I call wellness, and the second one is fairness. So I'll give you a few examples of each one of them. So if you look at self, for example, I am valued by myself because I experience self-acceptance and self-esteem. And you might say these are wellness dynamics. And the same for social support. In relationships, it's a psychological construct. It's part of wellness. The same for community. I experience belonging. So these are factors that contribute to our psychological, emotional well-being. And that's important, but that's not enough. Because we don't want just to feel supported, we want to feel respected. And respect is part of fairness. And the same for self-determination. When you look at how we want to make a difference in the world, it's not that I want to experience only self-efficacy because it's going to make me feel good psychologically, because we all have this need to experience mastery. And we see this in little children, right? I can do it by myself, right? Or kids say, Dad, let me do it by myself. This is all the thrive, the motivation for self-actualization. But we also need self-determination. Self-determination is not just a psychological construct. Self-determination is part of the search for freedom. So there are threats to feeling valued and adding value. And one very important threat to feeling valued is being invisible. And usually there are sectors of the community or individuals who feel invisible because other people feel too entitled, right? And your level of visibility usually is inversely related to the level of entitlement of other individuals or groups in the community. So entitlement basically says, my ego is so big that there is no room here for your ego, right? And these dynamics take place in blatant and subtle ways. There are all kinds of socially constructed messages that tell some people, you don't matter that much here, right? You are not as important. And then, of course, there are also threats to adding value. And many people in our communities, in schools, children in schools, youth in the communities, they're trying to make a difference. They're trying to make a difference in their own lives, but they're not always very successful. And as a result, they develop a sense of helplessness, which is really a terrible thing. Now, helplessness is usually related to the level of autocracy in the environment where these people live. Because if you're going to your boss and you say, boss, we can do something better, and you're always put down, you're always suppressed, ignored, neglected, eventually you're going to grow helpless. So these are terrible threats to the sense of mattering. Now, so that's about mattering, and I said that mattering consists of wellness and fairness. So I'm going to say a few words now about the different domains of wellness. And my research team developed a multidimensional model of well-being, which we call ICOPE, for interpersonal, community, occupational, physical, psychological, and economic well-being. We developed an instrument that we validated with several populations. It's called the ICOPE scale of well-being. You can look it up. I left a bunch of resources at the resource table with some references for this instrument. So we found out that there are individual factors that are highly correlated to overall well-being. So these ICOPE domains, interpersonal, community, occupational, etc., it's not surprising that both A, they are independent factors, and B, they're highly correlated to overall well-being. So in our studies, we were able to do some convergence validity, and they're highly correlated with existing independent measures. So our contribution was to say, well-being is not just about your physical or psychological well-being, but it is also about your community well-being. It is also about your economic well-being. It is about your occupational well-being. And many of the existing measures of well-being tend to focus just on one or the other. So we felt it was really important to bring it all under one umbrella. Well-being is about all those things. Once we developed the model of well-being, we wanted to develop a model of change. So what we did was we integrated different theories, including the trans-theoretical model of change, and we really borrowed and stole from a number of theories that, in our view, had the potential to be translated into a large audience so that without too much professional assistance, you can use these skills by yourself. So it was really an exercise in translational science. And we translated all these proven methods of change. We summarized it in this acronym called BER-I-CAN for behaviors, emotions, thoughts, interactions, context, awareness, and next steps. And each one of these drivers of change has two skills. For example, under behavior, we teach people how to set a goal and how to create positive habits. Under emotions, we teach people how to collect positive emotions and how to cope with negative emotions. Under thoughts, we teach people how to write a new narrative about yourself and how to challenge negative assumptions. So we developed this model of change, and we embedded it in an online intervention called Fun for Wellness, funforwellness.com. I will talk about it in a few more minutes and give you the results of a study we did. So this is what Fun for Wellness looks like. It's online, it has videos, it uses humor, in games. And the idea was, how can we relate difficult, complex constructs in easy to understand and easy to relate ways? So again, this was an exercise in translation. We did the randomized control trial. These are some screenshots of Fun for Wellness. People are asked to set their own goals. We have videos dealing with the different ICOPE domains of life. We produced these videos with actors at the University of Miami. We worked with the School of Communication, with graduate students. They wrote the script. So it was a very interdisciplinary, nice collaboration. We have in our team a fantastic software engineer who put this all in a software platform. And we developed mini games that deal with the different domains of well-being. That was a lot of fun. So it was a very creative project of bringing different media to one site. So we did a randomized control trial with a well population. These were faculty and staff at the University of Miami. These are people who are pretty skeptic. You know, you talk to faculty about improving your well-being, like, I already know everything. You know, like, what do you have to teach me? So it was a pretty tough population to achieve results with, but nevertheless, Our study showed that we obtained improvements in perceptions at the psychological, interpersonal, community, and economic well-being levels. We achieved improvement in well-being actions. So it's not just my perception, but people engaged in more actions to improve their interpersonal and physical well-being, and most importantly, they achieved an increase in self-efficacy, which is really one of the best gifts you can give anybody, right? It's teach people how to fish, right? That's self-efficacy. Okay, that's about wellness. Wellness is a very important part of mattering, as I said before, because interpersonal support, emotional well-being, these are all part of mattering. But there is also the other part of not just wellness, but fairness. And fairness comes in several varieties, several flavors, but the two most important ones are what we call outcome and processes in fairness. So there is distributive justice, what piece of the pie do you get in life? And there is also procedural justice, which is, have I been consulted about important decisions affecting our lives? And we did a study with the doctoral student where we found that people relate to both types of justice similarly. In other words, a violation of distributive justice is felt as badly as a violation of procedural justice. So for people, the sense that I haven't been given a piece of the pie, for example, I don't have universal health care. Right? Some people say, I don't have universal. Why not? Isn't that a human right? Okay? So some people feel this really hard done by it. Now, there are people who feel hard done by the fact that somebody made a decision affecting their lives and they were never consulted. That's a violation of the procedural justice, and both are really important. So I developed a model called wellness as fairness. And when you look at this beach ball or sphere, whatever you want to call it, at the bottom, there are elements of justice. I start with intrapersonal justice or injustice. I believe there is such a thing as not being fair to yourself. You can barely find any research on it. There is only tangential research. But I believe that some people are not fair to themselves. People with depression, people with self-harming behavior, self-mutilation, suicide. These are people who are not being fair to themselves, who are treating themselves very badly. And the more intrapersonal injustice there is, the less the level of well-being that they experience. Now, there is also interpersonal injustice or justice, and you can see there distributive and procedural justice. I may be part of a relationship where I always get the short end of the stick, right? I never get what I deserve. That's part of distributive injustice. But there is also a lot of procedural injustice in relationships. It happens between parent and children, colleagues at work, couples, where people are not consulted. People feel I don't have a voice. No voice, no choice. There are also individual or more contextual forms of injustice, which I call either developmental or relational. Developmental injustice, it's a case of child abuse or elder abuse. People who, due to their cognitive or maturational capacities, are subject to the abuse by other people. There is also the case of organizational justice or injustice. And as you can see, at the at the top sphere, there are growing circles of well-being, all based on the ICOP theory. So they grow out, for example, of interpersonal. We want to have an organization where there is support, participation, collaboration. We want a community where there is equality and respect. We want occupations where we can be reflective and experience meaning, etc., etc. So the model basically says, and there is a lot of empirical support for this, the more justice, fairness you experience in your life, the higher the likelihood of well-being at the top. And the same happens at the level of community, right? So these are just different levels of analysis where you can experience more or less fairness, either distributive, procedural, interpersonal, and then that's going to impact the top part of the sphere. And, oops, that went by really quickly. So this is a study done by Wilkinson and Pickett in the UK. It's a famous study where they compare levels of inequality and indices of social health. And as you can see, countries where there are lower levels of inequality, like Japan, Denmark, and Sweden, they experience much lower levels of social problems, like teenage pregnancy, obesity, homicides, infant mortality, low levels of education. The reason I put these arrows there is because about 15 years ago, I was living in Canada, then I moved to Australia, and then I moved to the US. So if you follow this, I'm getting sicker by the day. Now, a colleague of mine in Italy, who's now in the UK, Salvatore Di Martino, and I, we found this really interesting index of social justice developed in Germany. It's an index that encompasses levels of poverty, prevention, education, access to health, employment opportunities, etc. And what we did, we conducted some statistical analysis to see whether levels of international justice, justice across different countries in these domains, would correlate with level of life satisfaction and happiness. And what we found was indeed similar to what Wilkinson and Pickett found, was that the higher the level of justice, the higher the level of life satisfaction. So you have, for example, here at the top, countries like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, they usually perform very well because they are smartest in terms of social policies that support people. And what we have at the other end are countries like Turkey and Greece, Portugal, that are not doing very well in terms of justice and policies, and therefore they're suffering with respect to life satisfaction. So, first big conclusion of the day, no wellness without fairness, right? And just to conclude, I want to bring this back to the level of community well-being. And I think we need to think about paradigms for wellness and fairness. And I think for the last 150 years or so, we have been beset by medical models, educational models, rehabilitation models, clinical models that are based on what I call the 4 cardinal sins of well-being. 1, they are deficit-oriented. 2, they're very reactive. 3, they're very arrogant because they think that the professional knows best. To which I want to refer people to a recent book I came across by Ed Schein, who is an MIT organizational consultant, and he calls the antidote to this humble consulting. He also wrote a book about helping, in a general sense. And finally, individual blame. So if you go to a doctor, your doctor embodies all the drain elements of the model. Deficit-oriented, very reactive, very arrogant, and individual blaming. So I've been doing a lot of work over the years to work with not-for-profit organizations to promote what I call the spec model, which is based on strengths, prevention, empowerment, and community change. And if I had more time, I could elaborate on all of this, but I want to be respectful of our conversational piece, so I will be just happy to finish here with my second big conclusion of the day, which is resilience requires mattering, wellness, and fairness fostered within a spec paradigm. Because none of this could happen unless you are embracing a paradigm based on strength, prevention, empowerment, and community change. If we are stuck in the drain approach, you're always going to be working with people who feel, I am less than somebody else. This is a reactive model, and people are telling me things without really knowing what my life is all about. So I call this radical humility. We really need to embrace a model of radical humility to be as helpful as we can be. So let me conclude here, and then I'm happy to have a chat. Thank you. the political context around them, that by promoting intrapsychic ways of helping alone, you are not going to go very far. Because political oppression of dissent, remember what I said about self-determination. This is a huge motivational force in life. People want to assert their rights, to have freedom, to live in a place that it is of their doing. So from a very young age, it was just very obvious to me, especially in Argentina, where there is a very powerful psychoanalytic tradition, that psychoanalysis is not enough. Half of Argentina are psychologists, psychoanalysts, and the other half are being seen by these psychoanalysts. And it's not helping. Not that, there aren't things psychoanalysis can contribute, of course, but it was very clear to me that the political environment where you live, your ability to exercise what I call voice and choice, are really fundamental in life. And then, over the years, when you move to other places, you experience other realities. And I think every few years or so, I develop something new that I believe builds on the previous work I did. So for me, the lesson is the context where you are can be very enriching if you're paying attention. So I lived in 5 countries, and wherever I went, I tried to understand what is new, interesting, and fulfilling in this part of the world.
Great, thanks. That's it's very inspiring and helpful to think about. One of the things that I find really inspiring in hearing you speak and reading your work, and a reason I have my students read some of your work, is also that embedded in it is the promise of how our academic disciplines like psychology or the research that we do can be an important tool in this social justice piece. And I think that's something I struggle with myself in my career about, oh my gosh, I'm sitting here in the classroom, So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that for yourself in terms of the work that you've done, where you've seen, or those moments where you've really seen that the perspective you bring as an academic psychologist who's also, committed to social justice, working in communities and conducting research, how that can be an active ingredient, for that kind of change that I think we all are so passionate about, if that makes sense.
So some of you may have read the work of Paulo Freire. And Paulo Freire has these very interesting constructs. One is called denunciation. It's basically to denounce. To denounce what's wrong with certain practice. And then he has this other concept of annunciation, which is basically to announce the birth of something new and better. And I think I wrote my PhD dissertation on a philosophical critique of psychology, a denunciation. And basically, I wanted to denounce how psychology was being oblivious to external oppressive circumstances and making everything internal, right? And this is very much an American construction of reality, right? Because obviously, the US has a very imperial power in psychology all over the world. What happens here, a lot of people pay attention. So I saw my job as one of denouncing. So my first book is called The Morals and Politics of Psychology, Psychological Discourse and the Status Quo. My department of psychology wasn't too happy to accept my dissertation. It was called Psychology and the Status Quo. And basically, I went school of thought by school of thought, saying how behaviorism, psychoanalysis, cognitivism, as well as several practices, school psychology, clinical psychology, how they all basically conspired to make sure that people believed that the way to freedom and well-being is all within your head. And I wrote a book-length dissertation just on that question. As an aside, I should say, for the aspiring new PhDs, my program really hated the dissertation. They had never had a philosophical dissertation. And I didn't want to do an empirical study because I felt this requires a philosophical critique. So my advisor and I, Freddie Marcuse at the University of Manitoba, he was very supportive, the cousin of Herbert Marcuse from the Frankfurt School of Thought, so very progressive guy. So we strategized how to get this dissertation approved. So I wrote a paper as a PhD student, and I sent it to the American psychologist. And you know, one of the bars is if you get your paper published, it's good enough for a dissertation, right? So my first paper was published in the American Psychologist, and it came out just a month before my dissertation defense. So what were they going to say? You know, it's good enough for the American Psychologist, but it's not good enough for us. Okay, so that's part one, critique. And then I wrote a lot about critical psychology, because I felt that people weren't paying attention to what we might call today the iatrogenic effects of psychology. You know what iatrogenesis is? Harm caused by the doctor, by the healer. So I spent several years writing about the iatrogenic effects of psychology. And then I engaged, when I felt that it was out of my system, I began the project of what Freire might call annunciation. So it's not just about critiquing, it's about building something better. And I found a really good home in community psychology, because I saw that people in community psychology were trying to combine individual well-being with community well-being. Wow, what a concept. And I became very inspired. George Albee, who was the former president of the American Psychological Association, he was the external examiner of my dissertation. At the University of Manitoba, you have your committee, but you also need an external examiner. And George Albee was very kind. He wrote a very nice review of my dissertation. Then I developed a relationship with Seymour Sarason. Some of you may have heard about Seymour. Seymour wrote a review of my first book in contemporary psychology. So I was inspired by all this. All of a sudden, I discovered all these psychologists who were doing social justice. And it's a long answer to your question, but have I answered your question?
Absolutely.
I don't even know.
Great.
Okay.
And the stories are always better than the short answers anyway. So, no, it's great. And I think it talks, what you're also speaking to is that you're also building a community in your career, that there are,
yes.
the path is not straight, if I'm hearing you right, and on that way you're looking for those other people who are both sharing and supporting the way in which you're thinking about things, but then also helping you strategize to work around some of the hurdles, like a department that might not like your dissertation because you want to focus it on social justice and philosophy, and they want you to do the next study in line of something else.
Right.
Yeah.
And it is true that you said a very important word, or two words, building a community around you. So I obviously gravitated to places where there would be receptivity to these ideas. I never quite believed in being a radical that nobody listens to, right? You can be very self-righteous, be very radical, but you're so marginalized that nobody pays attention to you. So I tried to build communities within the mainstream. So for example, at my last move from Vanderbilt, actually there, right across the street, they have an amazing community psychology program here, but then I became the dean at the University of Miami. There was no community psychology at the University of Miami. There was no community psychology for like 7,000 miles in Florida. So we decided to build a program. And I feel very proud now that we started an undergraduate in human and social development, all built around the ecological levels of analysis. We built a master's in community and social change and a PhD in community well-being. So it was all about building a community, bringing my colleagues, my allies, recruiting really great people so that we can have important conversations and train the next generations of people who will carry the torch, who will continue to work on wellness and fairness. Psychology has done a great deal about wellness, but often without fairness. And isn't that obvious? Right? Isn't that obvious that we need to foster both wellness and fairness? And in a lot of things that I've done, I have tried to have a translational component to what I'm doing. So I'm a member of the section of philosophical and theoretical psychology, Division 24, and I write about philosophy, but I also very much write about application and translation to the ground, which is why we developed this online program called Fun for Wellness. And I recently wrote a book called The Laughing Guide to Well-Being, using humor and science to become happier and healthier. Because I'm looking for ways to talk to a lot of people. I don't just want to be insulated and just talk to the 3 people who can read Foucault, okay? So I'm interested in broader conversations.
Yeah. Does anybody have a time check? Because I want to allow... Okay, so maybe I'll ask one more question, then I'll turn it over, because I have a feeling with the head nods and things I'm seeing in the audience that there are people who are dying to ask their own question. It's kind of fun, though. I get to ask all mine first. So actually, that leads me to a last question that I'll ask you, because you're going to be actually talking a little bit later this morning about humor and about your book on humor. And it was a question that Dorothy answered yesterday as well, which I think is a good one, in addition to sort of the career story and how we come to our different ideas and form and build our community, but also how you work on the fairness and wellness in your career, right? Having a passion for social justice, working within communities, building new programs when they don't exist. I mean, all of those things take tremendous energy, even when done with collaboration, because collaboration is also requires a great deal of energy. So what are some of the things, you know, when we think about ResilienceCon, right? Part of what we're trying to do here is learn about the content of resilience, but we're also trying to do it more, to do our work in a way that's fair and wellness building. And so what are some of the ways that you have been able to sustain your passion and kind of cultivate that wellness and fairness in the work that you're doing?
I think I'm very much a developmentalist in that regard. And I believe that different people at different times in their lives have different opportunities to make a difference. And I think that it's really important to pay attention to the question, given who I am, where I am, what I know, and what I can do, what is the most useful thing I can do right now? And I think it is a balancing act between adding value to yourself, to others, and the community. So if you go back to that, to the mattering circles, it's very difficult to do any of this work unless you feel valued. And we can feel valued by ourselves, but that's not enough. We have to be in a community of people where they can support you so that all of you together can add value. And you can add value in different ways. So earlier in my career, I felt I was adding value by doing a critique of psychology. And then I felt, been there, done that, now I need to do something else. So I think it's really important to pay attention to our own developmental clock and to feel if you are growing as a professional, and incidentally, people quit jobs because they feel I'm not growing in my job. So I thought I could never do the same thing for 40 years. It would drive me crazy. So I was a clinician for 6 years. Then I became a professor. Then I became a dean. I'm a vice provost. I'm writing humor. I'm looking forward to going back to the faculty so that I could have more time to do my own research. So at least that's how I work. Every few years, I need to do something that signals to me that I'm growing, that I'm not stuck doing the same thing for 40 years. For me, that's the definition of insanity. So right now, where I am personally, I think I achieved I was at my peak in terms of adding value as an administrator at a big university. And now I'm feeling a change that I need to go back and nourish myself, feeling valued, by going back to my scholarly work. So if you look at these mattering circles, it's all about having a balance between I nourish myself, I am nourished by others, I'm adding value to others, but I'm also adding value to myself. And let me tell you, after 11 years of being an administrator, you're a dean, you're a vice provost, it's all about giving. And at the end of the day, you feel dry, right? And I am sensing that I need a change. And now I have a sanity plan to regain my well-being. So imagine, none of us can be just in giving mode all the time. None of us can be in sacrificial mode for too long. It doesn't work. You burn out. So it's all about having this balance between I'm nourishing myself, therefore I can nourish other people. You can't just be giving without paying attention to where you are. Of course, if it's all about me, then you become a narcissistic, self-centered, a psychopath that doesn't care about other people. So you see, there is always a tension between wellness and fairness. I can do a bunch of things that would promote my own wellness. I'm not sure it would be the right thing by fairness. Because I have authority, I have power, I have opportunities, it's my responsibility to do something good with this. That's part of fairness. I have to make sure that other people in my life are visible, that my colleagues, my family, my students, that they are visible, and that I do not represent a threat to their growth, on the contrary. So it's all a tension between what have I done before? Has that served me well? And what do I need to do next to balance my well-being with other people's well-being?
Questions from everyone else? Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much. It was really inspiring.
Thank you.
I feel like I'm sitting below some old wise elf sharing his wisdom with us, and thank you very much for it. I have a question about if you can say something, if you have some ideas. It was really interesting for me to hear about this adding values, and that all people have need for adding values to their community. But at the same time, I have this perception that people around me in my community are really deep into helplessness, and that they don't know how to. I don't think they want to add value to their community. So I'm just wondering if you have some ideas, experiences on how to, on some way, how to give a community that wind of change, you know what I mean? Like, come on people, we can do it, we can all add some value and we can live in a better, small place.
Yes. Well, I think that when people are feeling apathetic, it usually has to do with previous experiences of helplessness. That we've tried that, nothing changed, why should I bother again? Right? Seligman did this with dogs many years ago. You all remember the learned helplessness studies, and it's true, we all develop helplessness if we try to change something and it doesn't work. So I'll tell you what I think might be helpful. People need to experience self-efficacy and also collective self-efficacy. And you usually can do that when there is what we call the proverbial low-hanging fruit. Right? So what is one achievable goal that you as a small community can do to bring back to people a sense of hope? If you tell to your neighbors in the community, we're going to mount a revolution for freedom and justice and peace, that sounds very big, right? And almost unattainable. But when you look at effective community organizing efforts, they are usually very focused. They are usually attainable within the foreseeable future, because then we're going to be rewarded with success. And you define the goal not as peace, love, and justice for eternity, but rather you define the goal as something that you can all touch and feel. For example, we're going to get our good neighbor, Johnny Smith, elected to city council, because Johnny will represent our values in the best possible way. That's attainable. That's achievable. So I think that's the way to make change, to experience early success and to celebrate the community's efforts to make a small difference. Because that's where people are at, right? It's a developmental thing. We have to meet people where they are at. We wouldn't teach our children to write poetry before they learn their ABCs. And it's the same with community change. It's the same with individual change. So my approach would be, who are my allies in this effort? That's always what I ask myself. I want to build a new program in the university. Who are my allies? Who are my friends? And then I have kitchen table conversations with my small group of allies. And then we have an actionable plan. And that goes back to setting a goal. You have to have a SMART goal, specific, measurable, achievable goal. And you have to celebrate small steps forward. I don't think there is any other way. Does that help? You set up the conversation that I felt like everything I said was going to be a failure because you set me up as this wise elf. I hope I haven't disappointed.
Other questions? Yeah, Katie.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, particularly from your varied positions, especially as an administrator, if you had some insights or advice around infrastructure that supports graduate students in terms of wellness and fairness. I think they're often like spade to spade when people are just like self-care and you're just like, I have zero money and time to do this. And also that still supports a sort of individualistic like bootstraps, like here's this other responsibility you have to take care of yourself. Yeah. Whereas institutionally we don't really, we're not going to put any of the supports in place for you to do that kind of thing. And also you might feel really undervalued, but not feeling like you're contributing in a way that maybe you were a clinician in the past and now you're training to be a researcher, and that can feel sometimes like a really isolating experience or where you're not adding a lot of value. So those dimensions of wellness and fairness can be deficient in ways for students, and thinking about the ways in which an infrastructure of a program can support graduate students in attaining those things.
I think that the structure is really important, but it's very hard to have a supportive structure when you don't have supportive people. So you can have really supportive people who are very disorganized, and they don't create a space for the students to feel valued and appreciated. So good people is not enough. You have to have good structures. Now, you can have good structures, but if you don't have good people, when you go to the meeting, it's a disaster, right? So my approach was first, if I give the example of these programs we built at the University of Miami, was to hire very supportive people. To hire people who would have the well-being of their students in mind. That's a sacred value for me. I'm a dean of education. I really care about the student experience. So we were very methodic and very careful about who we hired into this program. And I'm very proud to say that we recruited people who really care deeply about the well-being of their students. It's about building your team. And if you don't have a good team, they're not going to play very well. Now, sometimes you make a mistake. And you can make two kinds of mistakes in addressing the question that you posed. One, you hire the wrong people. Two, you have bad structures or no structures. So you have to be mindful of the people in your team, and you have to be mindful of how to be proactive. It's not enough to be a good guy, right? In your head, right? It's not enough to be a mensch just thinking that you're a good person. You also have to be building infrastructure, support groups, writing groups, seminars, whatever it is that we need to support one another.
And maybe like if you could speak to a larger structure, so that presumably if you were like, I hired all these lovely people and we're going to pay them $30,000 a year, you're not going to have those lovely people for very long. So presumably you had a larger structure that gave you the resources to be able to hire good people that will endure for a while, that allows for like, we're only going to ask you to teach one class a quarter because we recognize you have all these mentorship responsibilities to these new students that are coming in.
Right.
So if you had any comments on like a larger institutional structure that supported you to implement those things.
Right. So then it's a question of asking yourself, I go back to knowing what I know, given where I am, what is it that I can do at this stage of my life? So I was a very happy professor here at Vanderbilt University. But then I was feeling that things could be better in an academic environment. And then I said, I either have to put up or shut up. And I said, okay, if Isaac, if you're so smart, if you think that things could be better, what are you going to do about this? So I said, I want to be a dean of my own school. And that's what I did. So I believe, other people can be very effective changing structures from the outside. I am most effective working from the inside. Right? So I became an essential player of a big institution. I assumed positions of power. And once you have power, you can make changes. And if you're an administrator, you have to work with your colleagues, you have to work with the senior administration to give you more resources. So, we can spend a lot of time talking about how to strategize. But I believe unless people with good values step up to positions of leadership, you can just complain from the side, but nothing will change. Right? So being 11 years in administration, I was able to do things that I'm pretty happy about. Right? Now I'm feeling a little tired. So it's time for me to change, but that's good. I hired enough great people that they will be able to follow this tradition that we created in our school. Students come first. Student well-being is primordial to the vision of our school. So it's a combination of people and structures. And you can't do this unless you have positions of authority.
So I think that's a good, no, we're just about out of time, I think. 4 minutes? Okay, time for one more.
Can I just make it,
Oh.
not ask a question, but just make a suggestion that people whose questions maybe get like posted to a whiteboard where other people could just add ideas. So like I think I have some ideas about institutional ways to develop supports for students, and I'm sure all the experts here do as well. So maybe you could like start a conversation.
Great.
Yes, that's a good idea. We'll
Over there.
figure that out, but you had a...
So I'll try to make it very brief. Your picture that showed the different countries of happiness, the most happy and fair and least happy and fair, and the importance of external validation to feel that value and to feel that wellness. In a country like America, where you have there's very clear divisions in terms of value, human value, value of life. And how do we move from the academic, from the smaller community, from the churches, where all of us are going to agree this is what we need to do? How do we move forward, other than running for president? I wish you could, if you're born here. How do we make those changes at the political level that will really change, how we teach fairness and wellness in our schools, how we make it a law in terms of fairness and wellness that are actually applicable and done in a way that we see actual change in my lifetime at least.
Yes, Sai-Kan is an organizer. And he would answer your question with 3 words: organize, organize, and organize. I voted for Bernie Sanders. For me, he was the most hopeful candidate to bring some of the values that you are espousing to the table. So obviously, it needs to be a multi-level effort within your schools, within your communities, but obviously at the policy level, right? Because when you look at the Nordic countries, they are smarter. They know how to organize for wellness and fairness. So people need to get involved at the federal, state level, at all the levels, in order to make a difference. And by the way, some of these countries like Finland, they were not a happy country after Second World War. They were destroyed, they didn't have a good education system. So that's an example of a country that within 40 years made an absolute tremendous change for the better in their educational policies, in their social policies. Of course, the US is not Finland, it's more diverse, it's bigger, blah, blah, blah. But there are a lot of lessons to be learned from how people make decisions as a community through getting involved. And I can give you examples, from all over the world where positive change has taken place. For example, in Kerala, which is a state in southwest India, Kerala had a matriarchal revolution about 150 years ago. And women took power. They organized and they took over the government. And ever since, Kerala has had the most progressive social policies in India for 150 years. They have the lowest infant mortality rate, the highest level of education and literacy, longest life expectancy, and they didn't necessarily make more economic progress. But what they did was they had the pie of resources and they distributed it more equally. So it's not just a question of making more money as a country. Obviously, GDP is important, wealth at the national level. But there is a lot that can be done to distribute the wealth better, right? So I lived in Canada for 15 years. In Canada, we paid much more taxes than we pay in the US. But we got great universal health care, right? And we got great public education. And a lot of safety nets that people in other countries don't have. So there are ways to make a difference. It all starts with getting involved.
So getting involved, that's a good way to end our morning. Thank you. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you.
as I-
Thank you for making me feel valued. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.